All right, welcome. We are in the book of Joshua. If you would like to follow along in your own Bible, if you do not have a Bible, feel free to use the one in the pew in front of you. If you do not own a Bible, feel free to take that pew Bible home with you. That is our gift to you. And Audrey, unfortunately, I do not have a video clip for today, but I did still manage to work in some video references. Because how many people, by show of hands, have heard of the Mandela effect? All right, so a good number of you. For those of you who've never heard of it, the Mandela effect is when a group of people remember something differently than it actually happened, typically referring to something historical, something that has taken place, but sometimes it can be an item of culture or something where we remember it differently. The name comes from President Nelson Mandela, who, one of the earliest documented cases of this, people believed he died in prison during apartheid. The reality is, he did not. He was released from prison and actually went on to become President Nelson Mandela of South Africa. This is very well documented, yet there were large groups of people who were 100% convinced that he had passed away in prison. So this thing called the Mandela effect came into existence. I want to show you a few examples of those this morning. This is definitely an interactive time. I'd love to hear your answers. For example, do we know who this is? Darth Vader, absolutely. And who can tell me what Darth Vader's most famous line, spoiler, by the way, most famous line is in the Star Wars movies? Luke, I am your father. I don't know who said it, but that's wrong. That is a perfect example of the Mandela effect. Most of us would say that that is his line. Luke, I am your father. But if you go back and check the movie and rewatch the scene, which I have done countless times, the actual line is, no, I am your father. Yeah, he never uses Luke's name in that scene at all. All right, how about this brand of peanut butter? Does anybody know what this brand of peanut butter is before I take away the black? It's Jif, absolutely. How do you spell Jif? How many F's? One or two? 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. There is only one. There has only ever been one. There is one F in Jif. And yet there are large groups of people who firmly believe there are two. There is another brand of peanut butter called Jiffy that has 2 F's that many people think that that's where this confusion comes in. But there are large groups of people. This is the Mandela effect. How about this lovely lady? Does anybody know who this is? Queen from Snow White. And what is her most famous line from that movie? Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Fortunately, I got to break your heart again. That is not the actual line. If you go back and rewatch the movie, it is magic mirror on the wall, who is the fairest? Yet most people, including the movie Shrek, if you ever watch the movie Shrek, they get it wrong. Get that line wrong when they think about it. Large groups of people have remembered this differently. Last one here, our little friend Curious George. Little tail or no tail on Curious George? No tail, you all remembered that one correctly. Curious George never had a tail, which is weird because he's a monkey. These are examples of Mandela effect. This last one is not an example of a Mandela effect. It is just a simple memory exercise, which means the first person who gets the answer right has to get a prize. So, here's the question. What was the first sermon series I preached when I came to West Middlebury Baptist Church? A little bit of a trick question in that the first message I preached was not part of a series, but what was the first series? No. What was it? James? No, James was just last year. 6 years ago. I get to eat them now. Anyway, no, 6 years ago when I first came to West Middlebury, my first sermon series was on communion. We did a full year series on communion and how we celebrate communion. Why am I bringing this up now? Because that was only 6 years ago, guys. Only 6 years ago. And our memories, I had to go look it up, by the way. I couldn't remember. I should throw that out there. Our memories are terrible, right? As human beings, each and every one of us have memories that fail us on a regular basis. We remember things badly. And in Joshua today, God is going to take steps to fix that. In fact, if you pay attention to today, I am telling you, you will have a better memory after today's sermon than you did before today's sermon. If you listen to what God is doing, you will have a better memory. So if you've ever wanted a better memory, this is the sermon for you. But one of the best ways to remember something is to repeat it. So by way of review, here's what we've seen so far in the book of Joshua. First, we are picking up this story right after the death of Moses. Moses has died. He had been their leader for the last 40 years. And then God takes him up on a mountain, and Moses doesn't come back. Their leader is gone. And this new leader, Joshua, has stepped up to take his place. We saw in that first week the fact that God had promised them the land of Israel, that they had been wandering in the wilderness and they had come to the shores of Jordan, and the nation of Israel is sitting there waiting for an opportunity to go into their promised land, the land that God had given to them. And yet their leader Joshua was a little timid. And we saw that God came to Joshua and encouraged him and told Joshua that he needed him to be strong and courageous, that he wanted him to be bold and lead the people of Israel into the promised land with boldness. And then last week, we saw that the reason that that God was calling Joshua to be bold is because God was going to go with him. God didn't expect him to do it alone, and he proved to Joshua and to the people last week that God was going to be with them in the same way that he proved it with Moses, by stopping the waters of the Jordan River so that they could cross through on dry land. And that's where we pick up this week's story. We pick up this week's story with them actually in the process of walking over on dry land into the promised land for the first time. And God comes in that process and tells Joshua this. He says, when the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord says to Joshua, take 12 men from the people, from each tribe of man, and command them, saying, take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you, and lay them down in place where you lodge tonight. So the Lord comes to Joshua and says, so you see the dry ground where there used to be rushing water. Like, remember the rushing water that was so powerful, it would sweep away grown adults, kill them. It was terrifying rushing water. And you see how that stopped and there's dry ground? You see those stones out there on the dry ground? I want you to take one guy from each tribe, tell him to go out there and pick up a stone. We're not talking a pebble. It's not a walk through the woods where you're collecting pebbles and filling your pockets. This is a stone. He wants them to grab a stone and bring it with them, because where they're going to camp tonight, they're going to put those stones. It says, then Joshua called 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. So God tells Joshua, pick 12 men, have them go get these stones. They're going to go to camp with you tonight. Joshua goes to his men and says, all right, men, I need 12 of you. Each one of you is going to go get a stone, and you're carrying it to camp tonight. And let me tell you why. I'm going to tell you why we're going to do this. Because there's going to come a day where you're going to forget what happened. There's going to come a day that even though you've seen this incredible thing of waters standing up and not proceeding, you walked through a raging river on dry ground, even though you've seen this miraculous, incredible thing right in front of your eyes, there's going to come a day that you forget it. And while that seems unbelievable now, I know it's going to happen. And your kids are going to come to you, and they're going to ask you a question. They're going to ask, Dad, Mom, what good things have God ever done for us? And if you forget that this has happened, you might not know how to answer them. So here's what we're going to do instead. We're each going to grab a stone. We're going to carry these stones to the camp. We're going to set these up in the camp. So now your kids are going to come ask you a different question. They're going to ask you, Mom, Dad, what's that pile of stones? And you're going to see those stones, and in seeing those stones, you are going to remember what God did for you. You're going to remember the good thing that God did for you, and you're going to tell your kids, let me tell you about the time we were at the Jordan River, and we were going to go into this land that we are now in, and God stopped it. I didn't see any way that it was going to be possible. To walk into that, I would have died. And God stopped the water here, and he stopped the water there, and the ground was dry as a bone. And we walked across it such that we could go back and collect these big stones. It wasn't like this quick run through. We could go back in, get stones, and bring them out. It was incredible. God is commanding Joshua, God is commanding the people of Israel to do something tangible, a visual reminder, so that they will remember the good thing that their God did for them. Continues, and the people of Israel did just as Joshua commanded. And they took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, according to the number of tribes of people of Israel, just as the Lord told Joshua. And they carried them over with them to the place where they lodged and laid them down there. And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and there they are to this day. For the priests bearing the ark stood in the midst of the Jordan until everything was finished that the Lord commanded Joshua to tell the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. So a couple different things we see here. Joshua commands the men to take these 12 stones and take them with them. I remembered that story from Sunday school growing up. I thought that was cool. As I was going back through, though, I never realized that there were actually 2 piles of stones. There was the one for the people to remember that they were taking with them to camp that night. I never realized Joshua went back in, collected 12 stones of his own, and made his own pile in the Jordan River while the waters were stopped. There were 2 piles of 12 stones. He didn't command the men to do this. This was what he did. It doesn't even come from a command from the Lord. This is something that he did. I think Joshua knew himself well enough to know, I'm going to need reminders too. I'm going to need to remember the things that God did for me too. If I am going to lead these people well, if I'm going to lead these people in pursuing God who does great things, I am going to need to remember that I follow a God who does great things. So he goes and sets up this memorial of his own right in the middle of the water. And it's right where it says the priests were standing. That reminder that the priests needed to step into the water before the waters parted. And then verse 10 here is interesting. It says, for the priests bearing the ark stood in the midst of the Jordan until everything was finished that the Lord commanded Joshua to tell the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. Which is a weird thing to say since Moses is dead. Moses wasn't the one giving the command, God was. So I went and looked up, what is this talking about this week? And what I found was Moses had actually given Joshua commands knowing that Joshua was going to take over when he died. And if we go back to the book of Deuteronomy, what we see is this. Deuteronomy 31:7, then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, be strong and courageous. Remember, that's our term for bold that we're using for this series. We've already seen that multiple times in Joshua. It says, be strong and courageous, for you shall go with his people into the land the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall put them in possession of it. This is the command that Moses gave to Joshua. Look, you are going to take these people into the promised land, and they are going to take possession of it. Fast forward to the end. Moses is dead. Joshua is now at the bank of the Jordan. They have just crossed over the Jordan. They are now standing on the other bank of the Jordan. And the writer of Joshua says, they have completed everything that Moses commanded Joshua. But this last part of what Joshua commanded them is that they're going to take possession of the land. They have not done that yet. They have just showed up. They are barely across the border into their land. And yet the writer of Joshua is saying that they have already fulfilled everything that Moses commanded to Joshua. And I think that is the writer of Joshua either giving us a little bit of foreknowledge, he knows what's coming next, or just taking the bold step, the strong and courageous step to say, you know what? God has promised this land to us. God has promised that we are going to take possession of this land. So now that our feet are in the land, there is only one option for what comes next. God must do, God will do, God always does exactly what he says he's going to do. So now that we're here, we might as well have possession of the land. It's our land now because our God is the one who's going before us. He just proved it. He has fulfilled everything that Moses commanded Joshua. It says the people passed over in haste. And when all the people had finished passing over with the ark of the Lord and the priests, and when all the people had finished passing over, the ark of the Lord and the priests passed over before the people. The sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh passed over armed before the people of Israel, as Moses had told them. About 40,000 ready for war passed over before the Lord for battle, to the plains of Jericho. And on that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him, just as they had stood in awe of Moses all the days of his life. So the people of Israel are crossing over the Jordan River. They get to the other side. Now the ark comes over next and passes out back in front of the people. And then there's this section here about the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. We referenced this a couple weeks ago, and this is just, again, the writer of Joshua reminding us that they are fulfilling the commitment that they had made. Remember that these 2.5 tribes had actually been granted their land on the east side of the Jordan. They had already received their portion of the land and really had no need to go into the land. But in receiving their land early, they had promised Moses that they would go to battle. They would go to war with the rest of the nation. And we saw a couple chapters ago, and we're seeing again now, they are people of their words, and they had about 40,000 young people, young men, who went before them into war. They actually went first. They were the first ones entering into the land of Israel, ready for war, ready to go to battle for their brothers and sisters in the nation of Israel. And then verse 14 says this, on that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him, just as they had stood in awe of Moses all the days of his life. And I see this is exciting in two ways. One, God is fulfilling his promises to Joshua. He is lifting him up, and he is showing the people of Israel that he is with Joshua the same way he was with Moses. And the people can see that clear as day. They've seen the same miracle happen again under Joshua's leadership. They're seeing these things. And God is exalting him as the leader in the sight of all of Israel. But the second part catches me. I cannot say for certain that the writer of Joshua is doing this on purpose or if this is just something that sticks out to me. But it says that they stood in awe of him, of Joshua, just as they had stood in awe of Moses. And it strikes me just how quickly the nation of Israel stops focusing on the God who split the waters and starts standing in awe and amazement at the person that God used as a figure to make that happen. They are so quick to forget that Joshua didn't split any waters. Moses could not possibly have split any waters, not in his skill set. God is the one doing the miracle, and yet they stand in awe of Joshua. They stand in awe of Moses instead of the God who appointed Joshua, instead of the God who appointed Moses. And it's just a reminder for me, and I think a reminder for us, that no matter who is leading, no matter who's the person out in front is, we need to keep our eyes on the God who we are following, not the person that he is using. continues. He says, "And the Lord said to Joshua, command the priests bearing the ark of the testimony to come up out of the Jordan." So Joshua commanded the priests, come up out of the Jordan. And when the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord came up from the midst of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet were lifted up on dry ground, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed its banks as before. Two things here. First, this repeated phrase is not an accident. You've seen some of this already as we've been going through, and I wanted to stop because we're going to see it again and again in the book of Joshua. This almost comical repetition. It'd be the kind of thing that today in movies you see it all the time. It's there is no way I will ever in 1,000 years do such and such and such. And then it cuts to a scene of them doing exactly what they said they weren't just about to do. It's almost the inverse of that. This is, the Lord commanded Joshua, command the priests bearing the ark of the testimony to come out of the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priests come up out of the Jordan. It's a repetition to drive home a very simple but very important fact. Joshua did exactly word for word what God commanded Joshua to do. It is God who's giving the orders here, not Joshua. Joshua is in command because he is obeying God. We're actually going to see in a few weeks what happens when you make the opposite decision, when you choose not to obey. But at this point, Joshua is doing exactly what God commands him to do, word for word, doing as he is instructed. And when the priest bearing the ark came out, the waters rushed back in. This is neat. In a culture today where we are trying to, and we regularly try to scientifically explain why and how everything in Scripture happens, I think the writer of Joshua and God specifically, knowing we would have a culture like this one day, started building in things to tell us to knock that off. Because what we see is multiple explanations. Watch the History Channel. I've seen it on there at least once, multiple other places, where people try to explain this miracle away as, well, this time of year, there are some really strong winds that come across this part, and it blows so hard that it would blow against the water, and the water would stack up on one side, and once that happens, and then they could cross over, and then eventually the winds would go away. Or, this is all just hyperbole. This is just, they got to the Jordan River, they waited on the Lord, like 6 months until it wasn't rushing over anymore. And then when it went down, then they crossed over on ground that was, it wasn't dry ground, it was like shallow water, so it was like dry ground. It's just hyperbole. It's not real. But the writer of Joshua makes it very, very clear that that was not the case. He multiple times says dry ground. He sends them back into the waters where they can collect large stones. This was not just a freak weather incident, and it's not hyperbole. It can't be 6 months if as soon as they step out, the waters come back. It would be too much of a coincidence that it just happened to start as soon as they put their feet in the water, not as they sat on the banks waiting, and too much of a coincidence that as soon as they step out, it comes back. They use very specific, very clear language to say this is not a freak experience in nature. This is a miracle that God performed outside of the realms of nature to prove to his people, I am with Joshua. I am with you. We are in this together. Let's go. So the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones, which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what did these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and that you may fear the Lord your God forever. So in summary, Joshua, when they get to their camp at Gilgal, sets up this memorial. And he says, the purpose of this memorial is so that you can tell your kids what you saw here today. And in case you've already forgotten, here's what that is. Here is what your God has showed you today. That he dried up the waters of the Jericho just like he did the Red Sea. And then he did that for a specific reason. So that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, strong enough to stop raging waters in their tracks, strong enough to split a sea and crush the strongest army of the world under it once he's finished. To prove that he is mighty and that you, Israel, children, people who are following God, that you will fear, respect, honor the Lord your God forever. This is the reason we're piling up stones. So what? So what does that mean to us? Some 3,000 to 4,000 years later. Well, first and foremost, it is important to remember the good that God has done. It is too easy for us to forget, especially when you get to a hard time, when things go not the way you expected, when things crumble from underneath your feet, when everything is going badly. We tend to be very, very quick to not remember the good that God has done because there's plenty of it. So what do we do with that? I would encourage you, if you want to have a better memory, if you want to remember better the things that God has done for you, create visual reminders. Doesn't have to be a pile of stone, although we did that at a prayer meeting just recently. We piled up stones as a remembrance of what God has done. It can be just take a piece of paper, print out the thing God did and stick it on a wall in your room. Keep a journal where you list all the good things God's done. Buy yourself a toy from the toy aisle. It doesn't matter what it is, but give yourself a visual reminder that every time you see that pile of rocks, every time you see that piece of paper, every time you see that action figure sitting on your desk, you will remember what God did that caused you to go create that reminder. Create visual reminders. It's the best way to remember what God has done. In fact, he didn't stop doing that in the New Testament, because we're about to do this right now. See, God gave us a visual reminder of what he did for us. We call it communion. We're about to take communion, and when you get it, you're going to get your little packet of communion, and on the bottom, you'll have your little piece of bread. That bread is there as a visual reminder that his body was broken, his body was beaten. That's why we don't give out full slices of bread. It wouldn't be as much of a visual. We give out a little broken piece of bread to remind us that his body was broken for us. It's also meant to remind us of unity. Communion is a unity event. We do it together as a church to remind us that we are a body. We are a body of broken people. Remember, in the gospel, we believe that every single person on this planet is equally broken. There's no one who is better than anyone else. There's nobody who's worse than everybody else. We are all equally broken, but we are a body full of broken people. And then you have the visual reminder of the grape juice. Jesus was using wine when he said that it was meant to be a symbol of his blood, a reminder of his blood, which he was shedding for us. He was going to die. He was going to bleed out on our behalf, showing that he was paying the sacrifice. Because Scripture tells us that without the shedding of blood, unless somebody dies, gives their blood on your behalf, there is no forgiveness of sin. You cannot have forgiveness of sin unless blood was shed. And what Jesus was reminding us with this is setting up a visual reminder to remind us that he shed his blood for us so that we can have forgiveness from sin. So we can be fixed and no longer broken. So as we take this, remember, this is 3 different reminders, visual reminders, which is why we do it regularly, of the best thing anyone has ever done for us. This is a time of celebration together. This is something that is cool. It's neat. It's significant. It's important. Remember it together. I'm going to pray, and then Pat will come and lead us in communion. God, I thank you that you regularly compensate for me, for who you know I am. God, even those of us with good memories can't remember everything. I thank you for this reminder that you loved me so much, that you love us so much, that you took my place, so that no matter how broken I was, and that is fairly broken, I could take confidence that you fixed it, that I can place my trust in you again and experience your love every other month as we practice this together. I thank you for that in your Son's name. Amen.